Last Monday when we didn't have school, we had a holiday called President's Day. So we're gonna learn about two important presidents this week. The first one is gonna be George Washington, and he was the first president of the United States a long time ago. So we'll read his story and then do our page. This book's called Let's Read About George Washington. George Washington was born in the state of Virginia in 1732. At that time, Virginia was one of the 13 colonies, and the colonies belonged to the country of England. So over here, which is now the United States, before it was the United States, there were 13 areas of land called colonies, and they belonged to England, which is across the ocean a little bit far away. Young George grew up on a farm. He loved to ride horses and catch fish. That sounds fun. George had many brothers and sisters, but he looked up to his older brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was a soldier. He fought for England. George also wanted to be a soldier one day. So his brother is a soldier in the English army. George did not go to school. He was taught at home. George practiced his handwriting by copying rules of good manners into a book. So you know how we do our handwriting on our pages like this, right? George, he had a book here, and he had an empty book here, and he would write down all the things in the book, in his book, to practice writing very neatly. It was important. At age 16, George went to live with his brother Lawrence. Their farm was called Mount Vernon. George rode horses, and now he hunted foxes. He danced at parties, and he practiced his good manners. He had never been happier. So it sounds like good manners are something that's important to George. Good manners should be important to all of us. At age 17, George had a very important job. His job was called a surveyor. A surveyor measures land using special tools. The land of America was still new. People needed to know where the rivers, the forests, and the mountains were. George did his job very well. He loved the land. So he's looking, he's mapping it out, he's figuring out where everything is so other people know. George grew into a tall, strong man, and in 1753, he also became a soldier. Now, when George was alive, people wore wigs like this. So George doesn't really have white hair right here. These guys don't really have white hair. He's a young man, and he just has a wig on. Isn't that funny? At that time, England, so the countries of England and France, were fighting over America. Both of the countries wanted to own this new land. George fought bravely for England, and in the end, England won. Life as a soldier was very hard, but George was happy when it was time to go home. See, his hair here is brown. He does not have his wig on, but this guy does, and this guy does, and this guy does. But George did not go back alone. In 1759, George married a woman named Martha Custis. Martha and her 2 children moved to the farm, Mount Vernon. George spent the next 16 years working as a farmer. So after he came home, after he was a soldier, he just stayed at his farm, Mount Vernon, and he became a farmer. Then, in 1775, George was called to war again. This time, he did not fight with England, he fought against England. Now the people that live in the colonies, they want to be free from England. They don't want the English to be in charge of them. The 13 colonies of America wanted to be free. The people asked George Washington to be their leader in the war against England. George didn't think that he was the right man for the job, but he knew he had to try. That kind of sounds like someone else we know from a Bible story. Remember when God asked Moses to go talk to Pharaoh? Moses was a little bit afraid. He knew that he felt that he wasn't the right guy for the job, but God wanted him to do it anyway, and the people wanted George to try to be their leader. England was a very strong country the war went on for many years. George and his soldiers were often cold, tired, and hungry, but they would not give up. With George as their leader, the colonies won their freedom in 1783. And they were not belonging to England anymore, so they called themselves the United States of America. And that's what we're still called today. Americans now had to pick a person to lead their country, so they had to vote. Who do we want the leader to be? The choice was easy. George Washington became the first president on April 30th, 1789. So he did such a good job leading the people in war that they voted to have him be the president. George Washington was a peaceful man who loved the land, but he never wanted to be a leader. But he served America both in war and in peace. As our first president, he is known as the father of our country. There he is. So you might see pictures of George Washington in different places. All right, first things first. My scissors are not here, of course. Let me go get them. First, we're going to cut off the bottom. See this dotted line right here? We're just going to cut all these pieces off. And then we can trace his name. So it's there, written there 3 times. George Washington, George Washington, George Washington. See if you can read it. And then you can trace it. I'm going to use a marker to trace. You can use a marker also. I'm going to do mine colorful. George Washington is a long last name. George Washington. Last year we had a friend named George in TK. This year we don't have a friend named George. Washington. And there's a state called Washington, named after George Washington. There's also a city called Washington. George Washington. All right, press pause if you need to finish tracing. I'm going to start on my cutting. We have to cut all our pieces out. And I'm just going to set them up right next to me. And I'm going to make sure I have my glue stick ready. Let's see, do I have a glue stick? I do. Okay. So press pause if you need to finish your tracing. I'm going to start my gluing. So we've got some pictures here. This thing that is sticking up in the air, this is something called the Washington Monument. So I forgot to tell you that we're going to be looking for the pictures that tell us about George Washington, and we're going to glue them down here. Now, not all of them tell us about George Washington, but the Washington Monument is kind of like, it's not really a building. It's kind of like a monument, something to remember George Washington. It's very tall. It's in Washington, D.C. So we're going to glue on the Washington Monument. We're also going to glue on the number 1 because George was the first president of the United States. He was the very first leader. We're also going to glue on the $1 bill Because if you look at a $1 bill, George Washington's face is the face in the middle. I bet mommy or daddy has a $1 bill at home. Go check and see if it's a picture of George Washington. We're also gonna glue on the quarter. This is a quarter. George Washington is also on the quarter. It's the, of the 4 coins that we use the most, it's the biggest coin. And it's silver. We're gonna also glue on the cherry. There's a picture of George, not a picture, a story of George when he's young about a cherry tree. And last one, remember what it said on the last page of our book? George Washington is the father of our country because he was the first leader. And that says father of his country. We don't need the baby with the flag, and we don't need the dog with the bones. You can keep them or throw them away. And there's your paper all about George Washington. If you want to color your pictures, you can color your pictures.